Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the Heritage Room and the last program in this year's John H. Ames reading series. The reader this evening, Kent Haruf, is a visiting instructor of English at Nebraska Wesleyan University, and this fall will be promoted to assistant professor at the same university. His short story, Private Debts, Public Holdings, was selected for publication in Best Short Stories 1987. This same short story was made into a movie, and in the past few weeks, as I understand, was awarded the Best Short Film at the Houston Film Festival. And will also, as I understand correctly, be traveling to other film festivals, so keep our eyes on the film news in the upcoming months. His first novel was The Tie That Binds, and he's also completing a second novel at the moment. And the way I understand it, Kent is not doing a Sam Shepard. They didn't star in the movie version, did you, Kent? Kent?
Well, I'm a little bit like my friend Ken Keith is when he's in Leon's and Marianne's place in Colorado. I'm just happy to be here. And I'm glad to see so many of you. I want to read the story that Jim was talking about, Private Debts, Public Holdings. It will be familiar to some of you, and that's tough. Since it is a short story, it shouldn't require any introduction, and if it does, then something's wrong with the story. If you want to talk about it afterwards, I'd be glad to do that. Anyway, Private Debts, Public Holdings. When Jessie Burdett became public property in Holt that spring, it was a matter of community honor. Her husband, Jack Burdett, had disappeared in January with a suitcase full of new clothes that he hadn't paid for. It wasn't this particular fact that bothered us, however. On the contrary, most of us were rather amused by it. Jack had been the manager of the Farmers Co-op elevator for about 7 years. He had grown up here. We all liked him and were willing to accept a local boy's temporary indiscretion. But after he had been gone for about a month, we discovered that besides shirts and pants and 3 packages of blue underwear, he had stolen $150,000 too. This money belonged to the co-op elevator, and since the elevator was owned in shares by half the county, we were naturally mad as hell about it. But none of us knew where he was anymore. The police couldn't find him. All of the All Points bulletins failed to turn him up. We grew increasingly hostile. In his absence, then, we sought our revenge on someone whose whereabouts we did know. We turned on his accomplice, old Charlie Soames. Charlie Soames was a local accountant, a 70-year-old man with wire glasses and a paunch, and we all knew him, just as we had thought we had known Jack Burdett. But at about the same time we discovered the facts about Jack's embezzlement of co-op funds. We also learned that it was Charlie Soames who had helped him. Charlie had juggled the books. He had been doing this for about 3 years. And now Charlie had pretty good reason to be mad himself. Jack hadn't told Charlie he was leaving either, so Charlie was still in town. Consequently, he was apprehended almost immediately and put in jail. And that contented us for a while. We looked forward to gaining something satisfying out of him at least. But then in March, when Charlie was temporarily released on his own recognizance to await the trial, the first thing that old man did was he climbed up into the attic of his house on Birch Street and shot himself in the head with a .22 single-shot rifle. And it didn't kill him. It merely scrambled his brains in such a way that any thought of further prosecution or eventual imprisonment was out of the question. So we felt doubly cheated then. It was as if we'd been deceived by 2 of the people in town we had always believed we could trust. As a result of these events and these feelings, We declared a kind of open season on Jack Burdett's wife. She was the only person left to us who might offer a sense of local redress. She seemed to understand that, too. At times, she even seemed to welcome it. Anyway, she stayed in Holt. It began in April. At the beginning of April that year, she appeared one afternoon at the elevator beside the railroad tracks. She walked up the steps into the outer office and scale room and told Bob Thomas she wanted to see Doyle Francis. This surprised Bob Thomas. It was just after lunch, and no doubt Bob had eaten too much as usual and was half asleep. He was slouched at the desk behind the counter, shuffling through some shipping receipts. When he looked up, there she was. "What?" he said. "What'd you say?" "I'd like to see Doyle Francis, please. I believe he's still working here." "I'll go get him." "No, I'll go tell him." "Hell, you wait here." She had her information right. Doyle Francis was, in fact, still working at the elevator. In the months after her husband had left town, the board of directors had begun to advertise for a new manager. But they hadn't hired a permanent replacement yet, because in the intervening months they had become suspicious of their fellow man, deeply, excessively suspicious. They had begun to insist on researching each applicant's past, and not just his work experience, as is customary when hiring somebody new, but his ethical and moral and religious history as well. It was as if they had begun to suspect everybody, to believe every man in the world who applied for the manager's job at the elevator wanted only to take their money, to skip town with it. In the end, however, what they really only wanted to ask these men was, "God damn it, if we hire you now, how long are you going to be here working for us before you think you have to add to what we pay you, before you turn out to be another son of a bitch like Jack Burdett did? You ought to at least be able to tell us that much." Well, we didn't blame them for this attitude, this new profound mistrust of others. We felt similarly ourselves. But because of their suspicions, Doyle Francis, who had been the manager before Jack, was still there in April, still waiting for the board to hire someone else so he could relax into retirement again. That afternoon, he was still in his old office when Bob Thomas burst in. "She's here," Bob said. "She wants to see you." "Who does?" "Her, that son of a bitch's wife. She's out there in the scale room." "What does she want?" "How the hell do I know? She just said she wanted to see you. That's all she said." "Well," Doyle said, "show her in, Bob. Or are you scared if you get too close to her she might steal your pocketbook or something?" "By God," Bob said, "I don't trust none of them no more. That's a fact." "Never mind," Doyle said. "Ask her to come back here. Go on now. Try to act like a gentleman for once in your life." "I don't need to act like no gentleman. Not with her, I don't." He turned and went back out to get Jessie. She was standing at the counter. "He said he'd see you. Come on, I'll show you where he's at." "Thank you," Jessie said, "but I know where the manager's office is." "Well, don't take too long. Some of us got to work for a living." Jessie walked around the counter and down the narrow hallway past the toilet and storage room. She was wearing slacks and a loose green blouse. When she entered, Doyle Francis stood up. He was one of the few men in town then, at least of those connected to the elevator, who still treated her with respect and minimal courtesy. He offered her a wood chair with armrests. She sat down, heavily, a little carefully. She was still pregnant then, still carrying that little girl of hers that Jack had left her with. She was in her 7th month. She set her purse on her shortened lap in front of her stomach. "Now then," Doyle said, "what can I do for you, Jessie?" "I don't want anything, if that's what you think." "No," he said, "I don't think that. They don't pay me enough to worry about what other people think." "Well, I don't," Jessie said. I didn't come here to ask for anything. I came here to give you something." "Oh?" he said. "What is it you want to give me?" "Not you, the board of elevators. The board of directors, the elevator, all these people." "What is it?" "Here." She opened her purse and withdrew a legal document. She pushed it across the desk toward him. Doyle picked it up, looked at it. "Wait a minute," he said. "Hold on now. This is some kind of a deed, isn't it?" "They said it was legal." "Who said it was legal? What are you talking about?" "The people down at the bank. They said I could sign it over to whoever I wanted to, even if Jack wasn't here to co-sign it. They said, considering the circumstances, it would be all right. Did they now? Doyle said. I'll bet they did, too. He looked at the document again, read it this time. It was a quitclaim deed transferring the title of a house and property over to the board of directors of the Holt County Farmers Co-op elevator. Her signature was at the bottom in fresh ink. All right, then, he said, I suppose it is legal. I wouldn't know, I'm not a lawyer. But then I don't suppose anybody around here would protest it very much, would they, even if it wasn't legal? No, they wouldn't protest it. Doyle laid the deed down on the desk. He folded his hands over it. He said, how old are you, Jesse? I'm 26. And you have 2 boys? Yes. How old are they? They've just turned 4 and 3, but why are you asking me these? And you're going to have another one pretty soon, aren't you? In June, she said. But do you believe in hell, he said. Is that it? She stared back at him. Is that why you're doing this? Because let me tell you, I don't think there is any hell. No, I don't. And I don't think there's any heaven either. We just die, that's all. We just stop breathing after a while, and then somebody starts to forget, then everybody starts to forget about us, and pretty soon they can't even remember what it is we think we did to them. I don't know what I believe, she said. Then why are you doing this? Will you tell me that? Because, she said. Because, that's all, just because. She continued to stare back at him, to watch him, her eyes steady and deep brown. Finally, Doyle said, all right, you're not going to tell me. You don't have to tell me. I think I know anyway. But listen now. Listen. Let an old man ask you this. Don't you think you're going to need that house anymore? I mean, if you give it up like you're proposing to do, just where in hell are you and these kids going to live afterwards? That's my concern, she said, isn't it? Yes, of course it is, but... And you agree it's legal, don't you? Yes, as far as I can tell. So will you please give that piece of paper to the board? You can tell them we'll be out of the house by the 1st of May. But listen, he said, damn it, now wait a minute now. Because Jessie had already stood up. She was already leaving. And Doyle Francis was still leaning toward the chair she had been sitting in. Those good intentions of his were still swimming undelivered in his head, and his arms were still resting on that quitclaim deed on his desk. She walked out through the hallway and on outside. In the scale room, Bob Thomas watched her leave. When she had driven away, he went in to see Doyle. Well, he said, she was here long enough. What'd she want? What? I said, what did she want, Burdett's wife? Nothing. She didn't want anything. I don't believe that. I don't care what you believe. That woman doesn't want a goddamn thing from any one of us. What do you mean she doesn't want anything? She's a Burdett, isn't she? I mean, Doyle said, get the hell out of here and leave me alone. God damn it, Bob. Go find something else to do with yourself. For some of us, that was enough. I suppose we felt about it a little like Doyle Francis did, that she deserved the magnanimity of our good intentions. Privately, we understood that she was innocent, or at least we knew that she was ignorant. It wasn't her fault, we told ourselves. She wasn't involved. We could afford to be nice to her. Anyway, we could refrain from actually wishing her harm. For others, though, who were more vocal and more active, it still wasn't sufficient. These people argued that the house didn't amount to enough. It didn't matter that it was all that she had, that it was the sum total of her collateral and disposable property. It was merely an old 2-bedroom house in the middle of town. It needed tin siding and new shingles. It needed painting. Besides, there was still a 15-year lien against it when she signed it over, so that when the board of directors became the fee owners of the house and then sold it at public auction, it didn't even begin to make a dent in that $150,000 that Jack had taken. No, they weren't satisfied. A house wasn't alive and capable of bleeding like a human was. It wasn't pregnant like Jessie was. Anyway, by the 1st of May, she and the 2 boys had moved out of the house as Jessie said they would. They had begun to rent that downstairs apartment in the old Fenner place on Hawthorne Street at the west edge of town. And it was Doyle Francis who helped them move. They used his pickup. Jessie accepted that much assistance from him at least, although afterward she sent him a freshly baked chocolate cake on a platter to square things, to keep that balance sheet of hers in the black. Well, it was a nice enough apartment. They had 5 rooms, a kitchen, a living room, 2 small bedrooms, and a bathroom with a shower off the kitchen. They also had use of the front porch, a wide, old-style porch with a wooden rail around it and with a swing suspended from hooks in the ceiling. From the porch, they could look west diagonally across the street toward open country, since that was where Holt ended then at Hawthorne Street. There was just Harry Smith's pasture west of them, a half section of native grass in which Harry kept some horses. So it was a good place for her boys to grow up. They would have all that open space available to them across the street. When they had settled in, and after new curtains had been hung over the windows, heavier ones to block any view from the street, Jessie began to take care of the money end of it as well. She began to earn a living. She took a job at the Holt Cafe on Main Street. 6 days a week she worked as a waitress, rising each morning to feed TJ and Bobby and to play with them until just before noon, when the sitter, an old neighbor lady, Mrs. Nyla Waters, a kindly woman, a widow, came to watch the boys while Jessie worked through the noon rush hour and the afternoon and the dinner hour, and then returned again each evening about 7 o'clock to bathe and put the boys to bed and to read them stories. She often sang to them a little too before they slept. And working in this way, being pregnant and having to spend that many hours away from her children, was not the optimum solution to all her problems either, of course, but she didn't have many alternatives. She refused to consider welfare. Accepting aid to dependent children or even food stamps was not a part of her schedule of payments, that local balance sheet of hers, I mean, since any public assistance of this kind came from taxes. A portion of that public tax money would have originated, at least theoretically, in Holt County. She knew that. And she didn't want anything from us. Not if she hadn't paid for it, she didn't. Doyle Francis was right about that. But then, toward the end of spring that year, she discovered a way to make the final payment. She began to go out dancing at the Holt Legion on Saturday nights. But no one would dance with her at first. She came down the stairs that first Saturday night early in May and walked over to the bar, lifted herself onto her bar stool, ordered a vodka Collins, and waited. And nothing happened. Maybe it got a little quieter for a moment, but not very much, so she couldn't be certain that she'd even been noticed. She looked lovely, too. She had made herself up and had put on a deep blue dress that was loose enough that her stomach showed only a little, as if she were merely in the first months of pregnancy. She was wearing nylons and heels. Her brown hair was pulled away from her face in a way that her eyes appeared to be even larger and darker than they were ordinarily. Sitting there, she waited. No one talked to her. Nothing happened. Finally, she ordered another drink. On either side of her, men on bar stools were talking to one another, so she swung around to look at the couples in the nearby booths. They were laughing loudly and rising regularly from the booths to dance. Maybe they looked at her, maybe they didn't. She didn't know. So that first night, she sat there at the bar waiting for almost 2 hours. Then she went home. The second time, that second Saturday, this would have been about the middle of May now, she drank a small glass of straight vodka at home in the kitchen before she went out. Also, she was dressed differently this time. There was more blue makeup over her eyes, and she was wearing a dark red dress with a low neckline that showed a good deal of her full breasts, a dress that made no pretense at disguising her pregnancy. It was stretched tight across her stomach and hips. Preparing to go out, she combed her hair close against her cheeks, partially obscuring her face, and then she entered the Legion again, walked down the stairs in that noise and intense Saturday night revelry a second time. And as before, she mounted a bar stool, ordered a drink, and then she turned around with that short red dress hiked 2 inches above the knees of her crossed legs, with a look of expectation, of invitation almost, held permanently on her beautiful face. Well, it was pathetic in its lack of subtlety. But subtlety and pathos are not qualities that are much appreciated at the Legion on Saturday nights. So she only had to sit there for an hour the second time before Vince Higgins, Jr. asked her to dance. Vince is one of our permanent Holt County bachelors, a lank, black-haired man, a man considered by many of us to be well educated in the ways of strong drink and ladies in tight dresses. "Come on, girl," Vince said. "They're playing my song." They were playing Lefty Frizzell's "I Love You in a Thousand Ways," with its promise of change, the end of blue days. a song with a slow enough tempo to allow Vince Jr. to work his customary magic. He led Jessie out onto the crowded floor and pulled her close against his belt buckle. Then he began to pump her arm, to walk her backward in that rocking two-step, while she held that permanent look of invitation on her face, and he went on smiling past her hair in obvious satisfaction. They danced several dances that way, including a fast one or two so that Vince could demonstrate his skill at the jitterbug. He twirled her around and performed intricate movements with his hands. And then they cooled off again with a slow song. And that's how it began, innocently enough, I suppose, because unlike some of the others, at least Vince Higgins Jr. meant Jessie Burdett no harm. I doubt that Vince even had hopes of any post-dance payoff. It was merely that he was drunk and that he liked to dance. The same cannot be said about the others, however. These other men were still remembering the grain elevator. They all began to dance with her. It was as if Vince had broken some taboo, some barrier of accepted behavior, so that now it was not only acceptable to dance with Jack Burdett's pregnant wife, it was required. It was a matter of community honor and retribution. And so 10 or 15 men took their turns with her that night. They danced her hard around the floor. They swung her violently around. They held her clenched against themselves, forcing their own slack stomachs against her swollen hard one. From that point on, they danced every song with her, and all that time Jessie seemed to welcome it, to smile and speak pleasantly to all the men who held her. When it was over, though, when the band finally stopped playing and the lights were turned on once again, she was very pale. She was sweating, and her dress looked wrinkled, worn out, stained, as if it had been cheapened. She went home exhausted. But the local routine was established now. That 3-week-long Holt County system of payment was initiated and accepted. And so the third time, that third Saturday night in May, it was just the same, only it was worse. This time the men not only danced with her in the same fierce, vindictive manner, but they also insisted on buying her drinks. She was wearing that same red dress, too, washed and pressed again, but showing the additional week of pregnancy. If anything, it looked tighter on her now, riper, as if the seams would burst at any moment, while above the deep neckline the blue veins in her full breast showed clearly. Nevertheless, she danced with every man who asked her. They danced and danced, waltzes, jitterbugs, country two-steps, a kind of local hard-clenched foxtrot, anything and everything the men thought they knew how to do, regardless of the violence and energy it required. And this dancing, if you can call it that, this intense communal jig, stopped only when the band stopped. Then, during these 10 minutes of brief rest between sets, the men bought her drinks. They sat her on a bar stool, and 3 or 4 of them stood around her, telling jokes and buying drinks, taking turns with this too, ordering her double shots of scotch or whiskey or vodka. It didn't matter what the combination or how unlikely the mix. They ordered liquor for her to drink and insisted that she drink it. And she did that too. She accepted it all, seemed to welcome it all, as if she were privately obliged to honor any demand. Of course, by the evening's end, she was even more exhausted this time than she had been the previous Saturday night. Also, she was very close to being drunk. When the lights came on at last, when the last man stopped dancing with her, she could barely walk off the dance floor. She was weak on her feet. There was a drunken waver in her step. She didn't say anything, though, nothing in the way of complaint. And when that last man thought to ask her if she were coming back again the next week, she said, "You want me to, don't you?" "Why, of course," he said. "Don't you know I'll be here? We'll all be here." "Then I will too," she said. And she was. Only by this time, many of the women, and at least some of the men, were growing a little uneasy, a little uncomfortable with this particular form of weekly gamble and amusement. So not everyone showed up the following week, that last Saturday in May. Jessie did, though. It was the last time that she went to the Legion for a long time. But again it was the same. She was wearing that same red dress as if it were a uniform now, an essential part of the routine, and there was the same excessive amount of makeup on her face. She was drinking, too. It was obvious that she'd been drinking heavily even before she arrived at the Legion. She entered the bar and dance room about 9 o'clock, and didn't even bother this time to lift herself onto a bar stool. She merely waited inside the door, with the music and smoke and laughter already at full strength around her. She didn't have to wait long. 2 or 3 men discovered her at the same moment and ushered her in. "What are you drinking?" one of them said. "Don't you want to dance first?" "No, let's have a drink. I'm buying." "All right," she said. "A whiskey sour, then." "Make it a double," he said. She drank it fast, as if it were no more than water or lemonade, like she was no more conscious of what she drank than she was of the banter around her. When she had finished it, she set the glass down and said, "Now who's going to ask me to dance? I thought you boys knew how to dance." "I'll show you how to dance," one of them said. "Come on." This was Alden Haynes, a man of 43 who was only recently divorced and who farmed a couple of irrigated circles of corn east of town. He was not a bad man, really, but he was still angry at the time about the divorce. His wife had been the one to initiate the legal proceedings. More to the point, he was a shareholder in the Farmers Co-op elevator. "See if you could keep up with this," he said. He took her out onto the dance floor. Pushing roughly through the other couples, he began immediately to swing her about the floor in circles and abrupt spins. Jessie kept up with him, moving back and forth or circling at the end of his outstretched arm. As we watched, she seemed almost feverish with intensity, as if she were resolved to test some private limits. When the dance ended, she and Haynes were both sweating. The band played a slower song next, and Haynes pulled her close to himself, clenching his hands behind her back while she held tightly to his neck. He rocked her backward across the floor in time to the slow music. Neither of them talked. When the song ended, someone else cut in, and so it began again, with the same intensity, with the same feverish resolve. It went on in that way until the end of the set. Then the band broke for 10 minutes, and the local men bought her drinks again at the bar. While they stood around her, not speaking to her very much, but merely talking and joking among themselves, while still paying close attention to the level of liquor in her glass, the rest of us in the Legion that night were also ordering fresh drinks. The 2 or 3 barmaids were kept busy carrying trays of glasses and bottles out to us in the booths. Across the room, somebody started throwing ice cubes at one of the barmaids to get her attention. "Stop that," she called. "I see you. I'll be there in a minute." Then the 10-minute break was over. The band resumed their places at the far end of the room and began to play. And Alden Haynes led Jessie out onto the floor again. It was a fast song, the band's rendition of "That'll Be the Day." He swung her violently out at the end of his arm, and that was the end of it. Almost before it had begun, it was finished, completed. I suppose it was the ice cubes on the floor, or perhaps during the break one of us had spilled beer or liquor in the dance area. We weren't certain what it was. In any case, her foot slipped on something wet, and she went down. She tried to catch herself when she fell, but she couldn't. She fell forward, hard, and didn't get up immediately. Afterwards, she lay there in her red dress, while the rest of us around her stopped dancing. She turned onto her side, pulling her legs upward against herself. Haynes leaned over her. "You all right?" he said. "Can you get up?" He lifted under her arm, helping her to stand. She was very pale. She was sweating again now, her face shining like wet chalk in the dim light. In the center of the dance floor, she stood unsteadily on her feet, while Alden Haynes held her arm and people watched. "I think I need to go to the restroom," she said. "Do you want me to walk you upstairs?" "No, I want to be alone." Later, it was obvious to us that the pains had already begun while she was still on that dance floor. We remember seeing her eyes focus peculiarly, a kind of brief, intermittent stare. But she refused any assistance. She walked off the dance floor by herself, past the bar and up the stairs to the restroom near the front entrance. She went inside, into one of the toilet stalls, and sat down. We waited for her to come back. When she was still there 10 minutes later, a couple of the women went in to check on her. She was still seated on the toilet, still conscious but quiet and very white. She was bent forward over her knees. There were clots of blood in the toilet. One of the women came outside into the hallway and told us to call the ambulance. The ambulance got there in 5 or 6 minutes. The attendants went in and brought her back out in a wheelchair, tipping it backward to get down the front steps. And then they pushed the chair up a ramp into the ambulance and drove to the hospital. And none of that took very long. The hospital is only 3 or 4 blocks east of the Legion, but it wouldn't have mattered if it had taken an hour. When they arrived at the hospital, they wheeled her into their emergency room, and Dr. Martin laid her down on a bed and examined her. He lifted her dress and noticed the blood. Then he listened for fetal heart tones. He couldn't hear anything. The little girl inside her was already dead. Afterward, he said the placenta and uterine walls had separated. When she fell, she had gone immediately into labor, and because its source of oxygen had been cut off, the baby had died within the first 5 minutes, probably during the time Jessie was still in the restroom. He didn't tell her that, though. He didn't want to upset her. She still had to deliver the baby. They gave her Pitocin to help stimulate the contractions of the uterus, but she was in labor for nearly 10 hours, and there was additional loss of blood, and she might have died. But finally, she delivered the baby late on Sunday evening. Afterward, they held it up so she could look at it for a moment. The little girl was ashen, but otherwise it looked quite normal. Jessie reached up and touched one of its feet. Then they took it away, and one of the nurses said, "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Burdett." So we thought she would cry then. We thought she would break down at last. I suppose we wanted her to do that. But she didn't. Perhaps she had gone past the point where human tears make any difference in such cases, because instead she turned her face away and shut her eyes, and after a while she went to sleep. She stayed in the hospital for most of that next week. Mrs. Waters, her neighbor, took it upon herself to care for TJ and Bobby during that period. The old woman brought the boys in to see their mother as soon as she was able to have company. And Jessie talked to the little boys every day and held their hands and brushed the hair off their foreheads. She refused, however, to talk to any of the hospital staff about the little girl she had delivered, and she refused absolutely to talk to a local minister when he came to her room to visit her. She preferred to lie quietly, looking out the window. When the week was over, they released her, and she went home again to the old Fenner house on Hawthorne Street. And then, in another week, she returned to work at the Holt Cafe. In the following months, she continued to refill our cups with coffee and to bring us steak and potatoes from the kitchen. And so I don't know what monetary value people place on baby girls in other areas. But here we learned in May that year that $150,000, less the resale value of a 2-bedroom house in the middle of town, was a figure that seemed appropriate. Well, that's all I intended to read. We can either talk a little bit or go have a beer, or both. Anybody want to ask anything or make any comment? Now's your time. Yes.
Is that story you read a part of the novel that your second novel?
Yeah, that sounds like a planted question, but yes, it is. It's chapter 8, as a matter of fact, of the book that'll be out in January. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can I publish that book?
Simon & Schuster.
Is there going to be a copy in this library?
Well, I don't know. That's up to Jim, I think. Mm-hmm. Yeah. About the movie? Well, Americans always want to know more about the movie, don't they? A woman named Nancy Cooperstein called me a little over a year ago and wanted to know whether the film rights to this story had been sold, and of course they had not. And she said that she wanted to make a film of it, if ever possible. Nancy Cooperstein's background is in Broadway plays, or she had been the producer of a play which won the Pulitzer Prize, and she herself had been nominated for a Tony, although she didn't win it. Since that time, that was probably 7 or 8 years ago. Since then, she had been in Hollywood working as an assistant producer of films and TV shows. And then a couple of years ago, Columbia Pictures started a new program called Discovery Films. The film company itself was called Chanticleer Films, is called Chanticleer Films. And they decided that they would give new directors a chance to direct. And so they would produce each year 5 short films. The first year that they did that, one of the films that they produced did win the Academy Award for short films. Anyway, Nancy was chosen last year to do that. And this was a story that she wanted to make a script of. She wrote the script. I worked with it a little bit. And another guy, a professional script writer named Richard Friedenberg, wrote a final draft of that script. Eventually, they did make the film. They finished it this last January. And it's been shown several places in New York and L.A., and will be shown again in London and New York and Toronto, I think. It's a short film, 30 minutes long, not really for commercial theaters, more for art houses. My brother and I flew out to California in February when the film was first screened publicly. They had kind of a party and had a good time. Those people are crazy, crazier than we know they are, or at least than I knew they were before I got there. Nancy is not, but she's one of the few who's not. I don't know what else to tell you. Do you have something in mind that you want me to address, Twyla? Okay.
Is the film true to the story?
I don't know if you heard that question. Minnie's asking whether or not the film is true to the story. Somewhat. Of course, it's a different medium. They added a couple of things that the director thought were necessary. I'm not sure I think so. At one time they did add a dog which had a red bandana around its neck. That was in the script, and when I saw that, I did everything I could to kill it. and it did die. But I think in spirit, I would say the film is a serious attempt to be true to the story. They've changed a few things to. Part of the trouble is they had to film it in California, and there are no grain elevators right within driving distance of Hollywood. So none of those scenes take place in an elevator. They all take place either in the cafe or on the dance floor. And I think they do something that way. Yeah.
Are there characters, I know the town is full, are there characters in this new novel that are also in the previous novel?
The sheriff reappears, and this character, Vince Higgins, is in there very briefly. But the sheriff has a Bud Seeley, who was the sheriff in the other novel, is again in this one, and he plays a fairly large role in this story. Mm-hmm. He's the only one, I guess. Yeah. Actually, it's Holt County. I know there's a Holt County, Nebraska, but this Holt County is Colorado, northeastern Colorado. I'm not sure that there's so much difference between western Nebraska and eastern Colorado. But, yeah, well, I could say something silly about that, but anyway. Yeah, I think they did try to do that fairly well. They did find a little town there near L.A., which seemed appropriate. Of course, they filmed very selectively to make the shots look right, and they did some of that correctly, I think. Mm-hmm. They avoided palm trees and that stuff. Yeah. Any other questions? Maybe that's enough. Yeah. Leon is asking the same question that I was asked once before by an old lady, this time by an old man. I don't know, Leon. Not in the near future.
The second book evolved out of this story, or was this story just covered in base chapter 8 or how to work?
Okay, I'm not sure you've all heard that question, but if I'm getting your question right, you're asking if the book came out of this story. Okay. Not exactly. I had in mind a scene, an image, at the end of this book. That's how my mind works. In the things I've written, I always know what the ending is, and then my task is to figure out how to get there. But this particular scene came very early in my thinking about that story, even though the scene comes late in the story itself. So I guess I would say, in terms of chronology, this story came somewhat after whatever the genesis of the story entirely was, but soon thereafter. If that makes sense to you. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you for coming. See you.